So, to my left I have Kieron Gillen. To his left we have Sankovitch. To his left we have Declan Shalvey, followed by Jeanine Schaefer, Mark Doyle, and the lovely Cebulski. So this panel is about breaking in and, more importantly, staying in, which is why we have a couple of creators here who've managed to do that and continue to stay in. So we'll just kick it off really with maybe CB could give us a rundown of kind of what he's looking for in the initial stages, and then how you can maintain your presence, your career in the comic book world.
Well, the way I often like to start these panels, as we did it yesterday too, is just take a little survey of the audience. How many of you here would like to create comics? Your goal is to break in some way, shape, or form creatively. All right, so a lot of you. How many of you are writers? All right, about half of them. How many? The other half artists? Oh, fewer artists, more writers here. All right. Well, it was always attributed to Mark Waid, but Mark Waid actually said that it was another writer by the name of Devin Grayson, who said that breaking into comics is like breaking out of jail. Once somebody finds a way to do it, that way becomes closed and you have to find another way. Because there really is no career path. If you talk to anyone who's broken into comics, they all have broken in a different way. So that's something that's always important to keep in mind. You know, you can't go up and say, hey, how do you break into comics? Because there is no easy answer. But we're going to try to give you some of the answers up here today to help you on your journey to break out of jail and break into comics.
Hello.
Hello. So actually, since we have a writer and an artist here on the panel, why don't you guys tell us a little bit about how you broke in?
This is one of the kind of accidentally, as in kind of, I came to comics as an adult, as in I read it as a child, as a teenager I kind of drifted out of the medium, came back in my 20s, and I kind of pretty quickly started doing my own web comics and self-publishing my own black and white fanzines and various other terrible endeavours. And I did. There is there is the argument that you break into comics by literally just scribbling on a piece of paper and talking your mate to buy it for 5p. And that is actually a real truism. Comics is by definition a very accessible medium. Comics by definition is a very accessible medium. And I would genuinely sort of say it's premature to worry about getting work, for example, at Marvel or DC or anything like that. I mean, what I basically did, I did Phonogram, and passively, I just thought about doing what I did and getting my work out there and just doing it. And the work begat other work, and when it started, it was basically me doing a 5-page story, another artist saying, hey, I like your stuff, we should do something together sometime. And that led to another 5-page story, led to a 10-page story, led to Phonogram, Phonogram led to other things. And the work begat other work, whatever work means. So yeah, I basically just stress the actual being good enough to do it. And it's like, I just want to say that very, very quickly. I mean, worrying about breaking in is actually not the problem. The problem is being good enough, because why would you want to be doing it if you're not good enough to get the work, if you know what I mean? That's what really the thing to stress about, and involves an honest conversation with yourself. I mean, I didn't pitch anyone for like 5 or 6 years, because I knew I wasn't good enough. Even though I was doing like my own small press work. So yeah, just really worry about your craft. I think that's kind of like, almost everything else is kind of secondary, because when you're good enough, they will come to you, as long as you've actually got work out there.
I'm sorry, I just want to very, very quickly. What? Yeah, I just want to say, just ignore everything that Kieron just said. No, I'm joking. No, but in all seriousness, I worked at D.C.E before I was at Marvel, and we tell people all the time, like, just make comics, and we will find you. If you are really dedicated, if your stories are great, like, just make comics. A friend of mine, how I discovered Phonogram was a friend of mine who wasn't even in comics, who read comics, showed it to me. Like, I was at D.C. and she was like, oh my God, you have to read this book, it's so good. And I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. You and Jamie were like, that we really believe in this story, this is the story we want to tell, and so we're just gonna tell it. We're just gonna figure out a way to tell it, and we're gonna do it, and we're gonna do it ourselves. And I mean, an editor at a one of the big two, quote unquote, saw it because just a friend of mine loved the story so much. So I honestly think that is how you do it. You're exactly right.
I sort of realised I never actually said how I got my first work at Marvel, which is probably relevant. Sorry, and that was basically, Warren Ellis basically did these 3 spin-offs to Universal, and he basically will do it and I'll pick the writers, and he basically said I want Kieron and Cy and someone else to do the 3 spin-offs, and the third one never happened. But that's kind of, that was my first work for Marvel, which was kind of because I did this indie work which people were into. And that kind of ended up showing how to do, Phonogram doesn't really say you can write superheroes, Phonogram doesn't really say you can write anyway. And that led to like Nick Lowe and Warren Simons contacting, and as I said, getting work out there, let them all work.
I would say breaking in is really, really easy. There's just a million stages of breaking in. Like, first breaking in for me was getting something published, and the next thing was getting paid for published work, and the next one was getting something that was, distributed by Diamond, or the next thing was like getting people to see your work. It's just a million tiny little steps. But there's a million different ways. Like I got into with Marvel through Jeff, who liked my stuff, and sent it to an editor. The editors are all fans. They'll all read comics. They'll read anything pretty much. But unless you're making the comics, they can't read them. So one thing I say if anyone's trying to break in is just start making stuff, because you can't send a script. Like, scripts are boring to read a lot of times. And if you have a finished comic, then you actually have work you can show for yourself. You can show how, if you're an artist, how you draw, what your work looks like, or if you're a writer, the way you write, your style. You need something to showcase your work, and that's the one thing to do. Instead of talking about it, or thinking about it, or planning to do it, just do it.
And we honestly cannot read, for writers, editors are not allowed to read scripts. We can't read anything that is not published. We literally cannot read them. So we'll get stuff in email, and like legally, we need to just hit delete without even looking at it. So it's really important that you guys are making your own stuff.
And it's never be the guy, it's like, it's the guy in the pub saying, I want to write a novel, and write the novel. It's really, that's, aspiring is useless, just do it. Obviously, it's bullying artists to obey your will is part of the actual job as a comic writer, so it's best to get practice in early.
And then what more?
I know it's just something as
I remember when a year ago my first work published, I was still showing portfolios, and I met some guy out in Bristol Comic Con. There's this guy handing out flyers for his comic called Phonogram, and years later, he's writing X-Men, he's writing Iron Man. Like, I mean, there's path to it. Anyone can do it if you just are dedicated enough to do it.
Sorry. And saying also what Bill on what Jeanine said in terms of reading scripts and things like that. Actually producing your comic, like just make comics. If it's a mini comic, if it's a web comic, if it's a small publisher, it serves many purposes, serves many masters. And it just, not that it shows us how you are as a writer and you can hire an artist, how to tell a story, but also that you have the motivation to be in comics. You took your own money and your own time and invested it in yourself, and that goes a long way. When we see people who have been publishing their own comics for years, we know that they're dedicated. They really want to be in this industry, and that goes a long way. And another thing that you have to remember is, Lauren and Jeanine and Mark, first and foremost, their jobs are getting out the books that they currently work on. They're carrying a huge load of books that they have to get out on a weekly basis. So when it comes to, finding talent, it's seeing it in comic form is almost the easiest form of presentation. You work with comics all day, but when you're on the train home, or you're just have a minute in the day and you just want to step back, if you have a comic book it's so much easier to just pick up that comic and read it. It goes a lot longer, and it's more likely to get looked at if you have it in that form.
I can talk all day about this. What's kind of what I liked about this panel, that's slightly more interesting than a breaking in panel, is the staying in aspect of it. And as the way I said, there's like a million ways, you're breaking in all the time. You want to be careful that you're not, cutting opportunities, you're not shooting yourself in the foot. You're always breaking in. It could be with a different editor, it could be a different company, it could be a different creator. But I'm not curious, how do you think you've stayed in? I would argue it's getting the work done, it being good, it being you. You know, like I wouldn't confuse your stories with anybody else, and that's what makes you stand out. You know, like if you couldn't do an issue, I'm like, I will get somebody to fill in. Can't really do that. That's the best way to stay in, I think. But what do you guys?
The other thing is Marvel, DC, Dark Horse. We only publish a set number of books, and actually the number of books we published over the last 2 years has gone down. So the number of the creators that we need has decreased, unfortunately. We are doing more story arcs, so we're putting out 14 to 16 issues a year. But you have to remember that by you wanting to break in, you getting in means you might steal someone's job, his or his.
Think about Sankovitch.
And so it is getting a little more difficult. And to be completely truthful, it's harder for writers to break in, much harder for writers to break in than artists. And you guys might want to be able to talk about a little bit more about that. There was somewhere else I was going. I completely just lost my train of thought. No, it'll come back to me.
It's still early.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, I agree that the staying in is the more difficult thing, I think, believe it or not. But just in terms of writers too, one thing I wanted to go back to in terms of breaking in, I think if some of you were here yesterday, I said this yesterday too, but you don't just have to, everyone's talking about make comics. It's not just comics, there are other things. If you show to me that you've written something somewhere for somebody, whether it's articles, you're a journalist, or it's short fiction, or I mean, there are a million venues to be a writer, and I look at a lot of different stuff, so I might find your stuff somewhere else. So just having your work out there and proving that you can meet deadlines and that you're a good writer and that you have some talent, we'll find you.